Welcome, everyone. And we highly recommend that everyone get a copy of Satisfaction Guaranteed. Our Jewish Book Council authors show great generosity of spirit in talking all over the country, whether in person or Zoom, and don't receive an honorarium for it. So we really encourage people to purchase one for themselves or as a gift or for their synagogue or church, wherever they may connect to. Before we introduce Micheline Maynard, the author of Satisfaction Guaranteed, this program is sponsored by Congregation B'nai Shalom, the Contra Costa Jewish Community Center, and the Jewish Book Council in partnership with Diablo Valley Hadassah. Now, I'm going to introduce our speaker, who has a very distinguished bio. Micheline Maynard is a contributing columnist at the Washington Post, where her work is featured in Voices Across America on topics dealing with culture and business. She also contributes to The Takeout, Medium, and the Ann Arbor Observer. She's known for her work with the New York Times, where she was the award-winning Detroit bureau chief and a senior business correspondent. She was also senior editor of the daily Boston-based NPR program Here and Now, which had close to 4.5 million listeners. Her newest book is, of course, Satisfaction Guaranteed, and I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing it right because I'm not from Michigan, Zingerman's built a Corner Deli into a global food community. Mickey has taught at the University of Michigan, Arizona State University, and Central Michigan University. For those who would like to ask questions, and I hope many of you do, please use the chat function at the bottom of your computer screen. And now, the author of Satisfaction Guaranteed, Micheline Maynard.
Hi, everybody. I'm so sorry to hear about your weather. We are definitely sympathetic. I'm in New Orleans this year, and we're definitely sympathetic because we're used to extreme weather here, but I don't think that we're in the same situation that you're in. We're kind of used to deluges, and you're not at all. So I just wanted to let you know that everybody here is thinking about you. I wanted to share a couple things. First of all, if there's anybody who bought the book and would like a signed book plate, in other words, if you would like me to make a dedication on a sticker that you can put into the front of the book, please send me an email with your proof of purchase to my email, which is culinarywoman@gmail.com. That's culinarywoman@gmail.com. No charge. Just let me know if you'd like it dedicated to someone, if it's going to be a gift, or if you're keeping it for yourself, if you have a tie to Michigan. I'm happy to personalize it. And I also wanted to invite you to subscribe to my Substack newsletter, which is called the Culinary Woman Newsletter. And the Culinary Woman Newsletter looks at the turbulent food industry. You might have seen the New York Times article this week about Noma, which is the famous restaurant in Copenhagen, Denmark, and how the owners of Noma have decided that fine dining is no longer sustainable. So that's the kind of topic that we talk about on the Culinary Woman Newsletter. I look at TV shows and streaming shows that people might like. I look at books that are coming out. We have giveaways for people who take out paid subscription. And of course, there's always lots of book news. One of the really exciting things that happened this week with Satisfaction Guaranteed is it was named one of Michigan's notable books for 2023. And the cool thing about that is that they're chosen by librarians across the state of Michigan. And they read 250 different books, and mine was one of 20 that they selected. Oh, I see someone asking for the link for the newsletter. It is culinarywoman.substack.com. So culinarywoman.substack.com. We're recommended by Dory Greenspan, who you all may have heard of. There are a lot of people who are authors and chefs and food business owners, and we have really lively conversations. So I'd love to have you all subscribe. So, and obviously in Culinary Woman, you get all the book updates from me. And let me kind of take you back a little bit. If anyone is connected to the University of Michigan or has been a Zingerman's customer, I would love to have you tell me that in the chat, because I'd like to get a sense for how much you already understand about Zingerman's. So let me paint a picture for you of the food world in the early 1980s. You probably have all heard of Williams Sonoma in San Francisco. You probably know about Dean and DeLuca in New York. You might have heard of Zabar's in New York. They were places that were elevating gourmet food. And in Ann Arbor, Michigan, there were two gentlemen, Paul Saginaw and Ari Weinswag, who met when Ari applied for a job at the restaurant that Paul was running. Paul is from Detroit, Ari is from Chicago, and they both grew up with memories of deli food. Now, Ann Arbor didn't have a deli when they got there, but one of the things Ann Arbor has is a very vibrant Jewish community. I grew up on a wonderful street with professors and music teachers, and our friends, the Pears, owned a clothing store downtown, and Mrs. Pear looked after us, and she bought Girl Scout cookies for me, and my mother bought bagel boxes from her Hadassah. And so Ann Arbor's always been a place with lots of wonderful people from the Jewish faith and who were actually allowed to attend the University of Michigan. So if you go back 100 years now, there were quotas at the Ivy League universities, but U of M did not have quotas. And so Jewish students from the East Coast came to Ann Arbor. Jewish students from Chicago, like Ari Weinswag, came to Ann Arbor. And so they blended into the wonderful fabric at the University of Michigan. Now, Ari, as I said, Ari applied for a job at a restaurant that Paul was managing. Ari did not have a food background, although Paul did because he was the manager of the restaurant. And basically the job that Paul gave Ari was as a dishwasher. Well, he's a Russian studies major, so he's probably the most overeducated dishwasher you can think of. But as they worked together, they started having conversations about philosophy, about business, about history. And I think they were simpatico. They hit it off. They're different people, different personalities. Ari is kind of tall, and I call him a philosopher. Paul is a bundle of energy. And in addition to Zingerman's, he's also recently founded a deli in Vegas called Saginaw's. If you go there, it's open 24 hours, and you can take a selfie of yourself with a life-size statue of Paul Saginaw. As they got to know each other, as they got to work together, they both agreed that Ann Arbor could use a deli, not just any deli, but they both remembered big sandwiches and delicatessen features like latkes and salads, whitefish salad, things like that, niches. They wanted Ann Arbor to have a place like that. And they thought Ann Arbor could support it because Ann Arbor's a university town. There are always people cycling into Ann Arbor. People traveled. They were open to food. And this is the 1980s when people are reading Gourmet Magazine and they're going out for dinner and it's entertainment and people are cooking at home and they are much sort of branching out much more than food in the 50s and 1960s was. I don't know if you ever saw a movie called You've Got Mail, but there's a famous line, pesto is the quiche of the 80s. Sorry, that's When Harry Met Sally. And, definitely pesto was on a lot of dinner plates in Ann Arbor in the 1980s. So this deli idea didn't come about immediately. Ari went out to San Francisco for a while, and Paul was managing a restaurant in downtown Ann Arbor, and his friend Mike Monahan came to him and said, I would like to start a fish store. This is in the late 1970s. And Mike Monahan's fish store is still open. It's a wonderful fish store. And Paul worked with him for a few years, got his feet wet as an entrepreneur, and thought, I still want to run that deli someday. So Ari has now come back from San Francisco. It's 1981, and the two of them have decided to write a business plan for a deli that they would like to run. They want the deli to have a three-legged stool of good food, good service, and good finances. Their goal is not to make a lot of money, but to make sure that the people who work there get paid decently, have access to healthcare benefits. And they're thinking about all of this before they even open the doors of the deli. So one day it turns out that a deli in the neighborhood of the fish store had closed. It was a little brick building on the corner of Detroit Street in an area of Ann Arbor called Carytown, and it's the traditional market area of Ann Arbor. I would say, you can walk to the big house, the big football stadium from there. It's about a mile down Main Street, but it's kind of right between Campus Town and downtown. So great location, but this little deli just didn't make it. And it turned out that the deli was available for rent. And Paul went over to Ari's house and woke him up and said, I think we're going to be able to do the deli that you and I are talking about. So they pulled out the business plan and they started visiting banks. Well, it's 1981, interest rates are 20%. All the lenders in Ann Arbor turned them down except one banker who was willing to loan them $20,000 at 20% plus 2 over prime interest. So they borrowed $1,000 at a 22%. Paul had some money from mortgaging his house. Ari had a legacy from his grandmother. And on March 15th, 1982, Zingerman's Deli was born. From the very beginning, one of the things that they wanted to do was, first of all, assume that customers were interested in the best food that the world had to offer. And they didn't necessarily have to be familiar with it or understand it because Zingerman's was going to educate them. And let me stop for 1 second, because we ought to talk about Zingerman's and where the name came from. So there was no Mr. Zingerman. And the funny thing is that people will come into the deli or they'll go into one of the other Zingerman's businesses and they'll say, I knew Mr. Zingerman. There was never a Mr. Zingerman. What had happened was they wanted to call the deli Greenberg's Deli because they thought that was a great Jewish name. They found out a week before they were opening that someone in Lansing, Michigan, which is the state capital, had claimed the name Greenberg's Deli. So they had to go back to the drawing board. They got out the phone book, and Paul came up with the idea that a Z name would be distinctive because, you can have A anything, but there aren't very many things that are Z's. And so they decided to call it Zingerman's. They came up with a very distinctive logo that you can see on my book jacket with that great big Z at the front. And the idea was to stick the Z in people's minds and they'd figure out, Zingerman's, it sounds Jewish. It sounds like a deli, it made a lot of sense. So as I said, from the very beginning, they wanted to carry very high quality products, which was a gamble because even though people were eating pesto and quiche, it's Ann Arbor. We're not Chicago. We're not Detroit even. We're not New York City. We're not LA or San Francisco. But we do the University of Michigan, and we do have this constant cycle of kids, their parents, professors, musicians, others coming through town and looking for something good to eat. And one of the things that they decided from the very beginning was that they would carry the kind of gourmet products that you generally saw in big cities. One of those was olive oil. One of them was balsamic vinegar. And this is a time when Williams-Sonoma had kind of popularized balsamic vinegar. There's only 2 producers in Italy that make the approved balsamic vinegar, and Ari was just fascinated by learning things about food, and he wanted Zingerman's to be a source of balsamic vinegar, olive oil, great cheese that came from all over the country and overseas, the best deli meats. And here they met someone named Cy Ginsberg. Now, in the Detroit area, Cy Ginsberg is a legend. Cy has his own deli in Eastern Market in Detroit. He has been an advisor to delis all across the country. He's the nicest guy in the world. He'll sit you down and he'll tell you how to do things. And so one of the things that Cy Ginsberg taught Ari and Paul was how to make corned beef. Well, he said everybody else was getting 4 to 5 pounds out of you take a brisket basically, and you cook it slow. And people were getting 4 to 5 pounds, but the way he taught Ari and Paul to cook it was to get 2 to 3, maybe 4 pounds out of this brisket because it was going to be the most succulent brisket that you ever had. But even he was surprised that Ari and Paul used Swiss cheese from Switzerland on their sandwiches, and they used real Russian dressing. And they basically decided that if they couldn't buy the quality that they wanted, that they would do it themselves. And that's going to lead us to a discussion of Zingerman's community of businesses. But I want to just spend a little time talking about Zingerman's in those early years. So it was not an overnight success. About 4 years in, they hit a cash crunch and they had to go borrow some more money. But what was happening was Ari is a great PR guy. Ari would go to conferences around the country. The word was starting to spread. There would be little notices about in Food and Wine. The New York Times noticed at Zingerman's. And by about the late 1980s, it was becoming popular and a line was forming out the deli, especially on football Saturdays, to get their sandwiches. And they specialized in these big sandwiches with so much dressing it would run down your arms. And so by the early 1990s, Zingerman's was the talk of the food world. But what was also happening was a rival had sprung up in Ann Arbor and was copying, at least Zingerman says they were copying. The deli, which is still there, called Amir's, said, no, you can't trademark a deli, you can't trademark a black and white floor. But Zingerman's felt that their sandwiches were getting mistaken for Zingerman sandwiches. And so they fought this battle in the courts for years. And it wasn't settled, I think, for another 15 years. But in the meantime, Paul had a revelation. And he decided that if Zingerman's was going to be copied, it better protect itself and it better start growing and it better be making things that wouldn't be so easy for people to copy. Ari wasn't convinced, but Ari decided, well, I have one thing that I'm going to insist on, and that is that Zingerman's, whatever we end up doing, stay based in Ann Arbor. I don't want a Zingerman's deli. I don't want to, in Plymouth or Detroit or Lansing or Chicago. I want there to be one Zingerman's deli. If we decide to grow the business, I want it to be small food businesses that people can go and shop at, as well as the products being used in the deli. So the first thing that they did was start Zingerman's Bakehouse, which began to bake rye bread and bagels and muffins and scones and pastry and especially coffee cake for Zingerman's to sell in the deli and then at the bakehouse, because Zingerman's took over some stores in an industrial park near Ann Arbor's airport on the south side of Ann Arbor. So the bakehouse was the first business that was started. Another business that they started was called Zing Train. And from the very beginning, Zingerman's trained its employees. It wanted them to understand the food they were selling. It wanted them to offer great customer service. And one of the things, if anyone's ever been to Zingerman's, you know that when you go in and you want to look at cheese, for example, the person waiting on you will give you all the time in the world. It's as if no other customer ever existed. They will let you sample several different cheeses. They had to kind of cut that out a little bit during COVID, but the samples, I think, are back. They were constantly getting in new cheeses. They were constantly getting in different kinds of meats. It is not a kosher deli, by the way, but, Ari said, bacon. So he didn't want people to get confused and think it was a kosher deli. He wanted everyone to be able to come to Zingerman's and maybe learn about Jewish food while they were learning about it. So Zing Train The idea behind that was not only that it would train Zingerman's employees, but it would train employees at other restaurants. And one of the first clients that they had was Rick Bayless, the chef in Chicago who is known for Mexican food. And one of the things that Rick was very focused on was making sure that his customers understood his dishes the way that Zingerman's customers understood their dishes. But another thing about is something that has become a hallmark of Zingerman's. And in fact, in talking about my book, I have found that people are just as interested in the business principles of Zingerman's as they are in the food. And there are a couple of business principles I want to talk about quickly. One of them is an idea called open book management. And essentially, everyone in a business unit is allowed to see the books for that business unit. And then they're allowed to see kind of a sketchbook of the whole enterprise. And it isn't necessarily that you get to know what the least costs are or anything like that, but you get to know what sandwiches are selling the best, what cheese is making us money, what cheeses, what are we losing money on, that sort of thing. So the idea was to make sure nobody was ever in the dark. If they were interested in knowing about the business, they could have information about the business. And if you read my book, you'll see all kinds of numbers about Zingerman's, and a lot of privately held small businesses would not share that information, but Zingerman's is very open about that. Another principle of Zingerman's is called bottom line change. And in bottom line change, this isn't just a suggestion box, but kind of like that. People who work there are allowed to make suggestions and make diagnoses and come up with resolutions of things that they think can be improved. And in my book, I talk about a decision to buy a juicer for Zingerman's Roadhouse, which is their sit-down restaurant. And what they had to do is they had to say, why do we need a juicer? What will the juicer cost? How can we amortize the cost of the juicer? What will be the improvement in quality and in using the juicer, and what are some of the things we can make with the juicer? So none of this is by accident. There's another concept called servant leadership, and servant leadership says that the managers are there to participate just as much as anybody else in the company. And if you were to come to Ann Arbor and eat at Zingerman's Roadhouse, which is the sit-down restaurant, as I said, you would see this tall gentleman in blue jeans and a t-shirt walking silently through the restaurant with a water pitcher. That's Ari Weinswag, one of the owners of the company. And Ari feels that by walking around the restaurant filling water, he can find out a lot of things. He can kind of get an idea of whether you're having fun. Are you all sitting there having good conversation? Do you like the atmosphere? Are you looking kind of sad that day? Are you eating? Have you ordered the special? Are you eating the special, or are you just leaving it on your plate? Do you want some more bread? Do you want some more French fries? That kind of thing. A lot of people have no idea that he's one of the owners. They just think he's the water boy. But a lot of people do know Ari at this point, and that's their opportunity to talk to him, to find out what's going on with Zingerman's. I have seen him give people his business card dozens and dozens of times. And so he's sort of a chief evangelist for the restaurant. And I've seen this repeated all across Zingerman's. And all of the partners in Zingerman's basically are out on the selling floor. They're waiting on customers, directing traffic. And so you are very likely to meet the person who is running the business. So when I say the business units, Zingerman's decided that as it added these businesses, the Bakehouse, Zing Train, it added a mail order business in 1999. It added a coffee business and a cheese business, that it needed an umbrella for running these businesses. And that's called ZCOB, or the Zingerman's Community of Businesses. The idea is, I think they've got 13 different businesses now. And the idea is that people who worked in that area could own the business. Now, it was supposed to be an idea for people to work their way up the ladder and then take charge of the business. What's happened in reality, because Zingerman's is now 40 years old, is that some people have retired, some new people have come in, some people have come in with their own money, some people need to borrow money from Zingerman's in order to become partners. But the idea is that they're invested not only with finance, but emotionally in making sure that each piece of Zingerman's is a success. So I mentioned mail order, and I'm going to assume that some people on this call have ordered some items from Zingerman's mail order catalog. The Zingerman's mail order catalog actually started as little pamphlets that were handed out in the deli. They would just take orders by phone and they would run everything down to the post office at the end of the day. But in 1999, they registered the Zingermans.com name, and they've actually gotten very sophisticated in terms of customer outreach through mail order. There's people that never get to Ann Arbor, but they know all about Zingerman's. They're very popular for corporate gifts, for bereavement gifts, for Shiva gifts, for baby gifts, that kind of thing. And the boxes come and they're very colorful, and the things inside are very delightful. I've actually sent gelato a couple of times as a Shiva gift, and I've had the recipient tell me that they hid the gelato in the freezer and they didn't serve it to the guests. They actually waited until everybody was gone, and then the family got to eat their favorite gelato. Actually, the most popular gift is coffee cake, as you might expect. So Zingerman's mail order has actually been a very integral part in saving Zingerman's during the pandemic. And I want to talk a little bit about what happened to Zingerman's over the last couple of years. So people have asked me how I got the idea to write this book. And of course, being from Ann Arbor, it's kind of a no-brainer for me, but I was actually approached by a literary agent, Irene Goodman, who is a double graduate of the University of Michigan and a big literary agent in New York, about writing this book. And so when you write a book, you write a proposal and it circulates to publishers, and then you end up with pretty much the publisher who's going to publish your book. So Kara Watson, who is my editor at Scribner's, and Irene and I set up a phone meeting with Ari, and the phone meeting was set up for March 15th, 2020. That should have been the day when Zingerman's was celebrating its 38th anniversary. Instead, Ari came to the call and he said, "This is the worst day of my life. I've had to lay off 300 people." The reason was that Governor Gretchen Whitmer had shut down the state, implemented stay at home because of COVID, and this happened across the Midwest, the Great Lakes, I should say. And the Zingermans couldn't serve people inside. They basically were limited to carry out, and there's no delivery. Actually, there's delivery for the deli, but Ari did not want to have delivery from the restaurant. So for about 4 months, they could not have customers come into their establishments. And over the next couple of years, Zingerman's had to innovate like everybody else in the food business. And one of the things that really rescued them was mail order, because people across the country were having trouble finding the things that they like to eat. And they had all these warm memories of Zingerman's, and they felt that Zingerman's could help them get through this very troubled period in food history, basically. And essentially, the mail order business grew to be about 45% of all of Zingerman's. And it essentially kept things afloat because these small businesses, very few of them could have customers inside. The bakehouse was able to because it was considered to be a grocery store and an essential business. One of the things that happened with COVID was that Zingerman started to think about its future. Now, the way the company is set up, Paul and Ari, who I've told you about, are the co-partners in the business. They get paid because the 13 Zingerman's businesses pay them a licensing fee to use the Zingerman's name. But they're both starting to think about, what they're going to do. Paul has opened his deli out in Las Vegas, and Ari is not planning to retire anytime soon. I mean, he loves it. I think that he'll be there as long as he can stand up. But the idea that they've been kicking around is to have the managing partners in all of these businesses assume the ownership of Zingerman's. They don't want to sell it. I don't know if you guys know Blue Bottle Coffee, but Blue Bottle Coffee was a very successful business around San Francisco, and then it got sold to a big food conglomerate. And they've kind of looked at that and they said, no, we don't want to sell Zingerman's to somebody. We want our people who are running Zingerman's to have ownership of Zingerman's. And one of the things that they do is they offer a special class of stock that people can buy. You have to have been there for a year and you have to hold your shares of stock. But by this point, everyone who's bought a share of stock has gotten back in dividends what they paid for their stocks. It's been a very successful thing. Going forward, Zingerman's is basically has recouped any money that it was lost during the pandemic. And it didn't really lose money, it just kind of stalled, but it is now back to a $70 million business as it was in 2019. It is aiming for higher numbers going forward. It is naming new managing partners. It is considering new businesses. It's thinking about its future. And if you read the book, at the end of the book, there's something called a vision for 2032. And every part of Zingerman's takes part in this vision process. And the idea of a vision, and I've actually written a vision of my own for my career and my life, and you essentially describe where you want to be at a date in the future. So maybe 2025 or 2030, that sort of thing. And it can't be, you can't say, I want my daughter to have grandchildren because that's not in your control. But you choose things that you think might be in your control. And you don't have to come up with the way you're getting there. You just have to paint the picture of where you want to be. So if you read the book, at the very end of the book, there's Zingerman's mission for 2023, their vision. There are a lot of things that they're aiming for. They would like to be a more sustainable company. They want to be using even more local producers than they already do. It's very much a company focused on meat and dairy, and I think there's a feel that that isn't necessarily sustainable, and so they would like to be more vegetarian focused. But at its very heart, it's a Jewish deli. There's going to be a corned beef sandwich. There's going to be a Reuben. I mean, this is a company that makes pot pies in the summer, in the wintertime, gazpacho in the summertime. It's going to be a place that always values very good food. It might not be that profitable. Its profits are about 5% a year, but it also wants to make sure that it has opportunities for the people who work there, and also that it can sustain the food standards that it has sustained so far. So with that, I'd be happy to take your questions if you have some. You can put them in chat or fire away.
I know Stuart Kirsch, who is an executive director of a synagogue in our area, talked about learning from Zingerman's Guide to Giving Good Service. Have you ever heard of other businesses using the Zingerman's craft?
Absolutely. So this is one of, I think, Zingerman's legacies. So Rick Bayless in Chicago is a great example of somebody who has embraced the Zingerman's Guide to Good Service. And obviously there's a bunch of different points of the philosophy of good service, but a couple of them are: find out what the customer wants, make sure that you can give it to the customer, and then make sure that the customer is happy with what you've given them. And if they aren't happy with what you've given them, see what you can do to make them happy. I mean, Ari doesn't want anybody to leave and be unhappy and post a negative review on Twitter or Yelp or anything like that. And so Rick is an example. Many chefs have been influenced by Zingerman's. Here in New Orleans, where I am, Commander's Palace, which is owned by T. Martin, the daughter of the famous Ella Brennan. She uses Zingerman's philosophy with her employees. Alon Shaya, who's a very successful chef here in New Orleans and will soon have a restaurant in Vegas, has used Zingerman's philosophy, and on and on. I mean, any city in the country, probably a restaurant owner has read a Zingerman's book or met Ari at a conference, and it's definitely a philosophy that has spread through the sort of artisanal restaurant world. Now, I haven't really seen it embraced by the big restaurant chains, but a lot of the corporate entities don't have the time, don't have the staff, don't have the inclination to be offering the intense training that Zingerman's does, because everybody who goes to work there gets a solid 60 days of training. They get lots of training their first week, and then it's sort of added and added and added. So in order to really live the Zingerman's philosophy, you have to be very open to this constant communication with people that work there and with the customers.
Are there any other questions? Well, you gave a wonderful presentation, and though I like being in California, very interested in visiting sometime
Yeah.
Ann Arbor. Are you working on another book?
Yes, I am very energized about the world of small businesses. And while during the pandemic, I actually was doing some writing for the Ann Arbor Observer, which is a monthly magazine in Ann Arbor. And I wrote a column called Marketplace Changes. And I met every owner of every new business in Ann Arbor for like the last 3 years. And I've met many of the young people that have started with pop-ups and are moving over to brick and mortar businesses. And the same thing is true here in New Orleans. And they're all doing it despite all the challenges of the business world right now. So my next book is going to focus on kind of a guidebook for small businesses and look at the environment today, because so many business books were written 15 years ago, 5 years ago. There was no social media when a lot of these books were written, and social media has changed the environment tremendously. So the next one will be looking at small businesses.
Great, great. Again, this is a great book for, for your own personal library, a friend's library, and also for a synagogue or a day school library. So thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. And everyone, to see what's happening, under1tent.org lists many of the cultural programs that are taking place in our community. And because we now live on Zoom primarily, they're available throughout the nation. I will give a shout out to a program on February 5th at 7:30 p.m. A former local resident, Alan Jacobson, will be talking about his newest mystery. He's a best-selling author. And we have plenty at under1tent.org. I want to thank everyone, including our sponsors, the B'nai Shalom, the JCC, and the Jewish Book Council. Thank you very much, Mickey. Our best to you, and thank you for your generosity of spirit.
Everybody stay dry and safe.
Especially that. Thank you. Bye-bye.